Whoa, 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 whoa. Hello, fellow humans. This is 28 years old Edna washing dishes outside her home in Masvingo district, Zimbabwe. The work she does for her family is not paid. Women and girls undertake 76% of unpaid care work in the world and make up 66% of paid care workforce. They carry out 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care work every day. If they were paid a minimum wage of $2.30 per hour for this free work they do, that would add $10.8 trillion a year to the global GDP, more than 3 times the size of the entire tech industry. If they were paid $15 per hour, that would add up to $68 trillion, which is more than half of the GDP of the world. What is going on? Why there is so much work being done and not paid? We find answers from feminist economics. We will see how capitalism robs both women and men of their time and well-being without paying anything in return. Capitalists have to start paying all work that is done for their benefit, or they have to step aside so we can create a different kind of world where all work is dignified and recognized. Why is a hetero cis man like me talking about feminist economics? Isn't that some sort of intellectual appropriation? I think not enough men are reading and listening to feminist economics. If they did, we would probably no longer live in a heteropatriarchal economic system. Women have been decrying the savage exploitation by capitalism for more than a century. There's a vast literature that shows this. In 1884, Lucy Parsons wrote, "Have you not worked hard all your life since you were old enough for your labor to be of use in the production of wealth?" In 1974, Silvia Federici wrote, "It is important to recognize that when we speak of housework, we are not speaking of a job as other jobs. We are speaking of one of the most pervasive manipulations, most subtle and mystified forms of violence that capitalism has perpetrated against any section of the working class." In 2010, Lindsay German and Nina Power wrote, "Women have been drawn into the workforce in millions, but working in factories, offices and shops has not led to an improvement in women's lives, far less to liberation. Women suffer exploitation at work as well as still shouldering the double burden of family and childcare as well as paid work." You can read 77 feminist manifestos in this book, going back as far as the 1800s. Before we go into more data and analysis, let us attempt some definitions. The goal of feminist economics is not just to develop more illuminating theories, but to improve the conditions of living for all children, women, and men. This requires the dismantling of policies that reproduce gender inequalities, income and wealth inequalities, intersecting inequalities. Classical political economy asks the following 4 basic questions: who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it? This who may be a corporation or an individual, and the context is predominantly production for pay or profit. In the feminist interpretation, these questions are asked for both market and non-market activities, and it is for both production of stuff and social reproduction of people. Unpaid care work is defined as informal caregiving undertaking without monetary compensation. This includes direct care for children, seniors, and people living with disabilities. Indirect care such as cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, related activities like collecting water and fuel. Paid care work is defined as direct care for people, including personal care and related domestic tasks, done within a household or institution for payment or profit, often within the informal sector. This includes domestic work, defined by the ILO as work performed in or for a household, and encompassing personal and household care, long-term care workers, healthcare workers, daycare workers, early childhood educators, and others, as long as they provide personal care services as part of their role. The care economy is made up of all forms of care work, both paid and unpaid, delivered formally and informally, through the household, community, state, private sector, civil society, and others. In low-income countries, women in rural areas spend up to 14 hours a day doing unpaid care work. In the world, 42% of women cannot get jobs because they are responsible for all the caregiving, compared to just 6% of men. 80% of the world's 67 million domestic workers are women. 90% of them do not have access to Social Security, and more than half have no limits on their weekly working hours. At the global level, women perform 76% of unpaid care work, dedicating an average of 4 hours and 25 minutes per day, compared to men's 1 hour and 23 minutes. This is about 201 working days per year for women, compared to 63 for men. In Latin America countries, unpaid care work is equivalent to 21% of GDP, with women putting in 3/4 of the share. Imagine if this work was paid, how big of an economy those countries would have, at least on paper. On the other hand, we have the very capitalist Boston Consulting Group that is framing care in opposition to work. They say that the United States care economy is worth $6 trillion, from which up to $3.5 trillion is unpaid. If paid properly, this work is worth more than any company listed on the stock market. Work is an activity separated from care in this graphic from BCG. Every week, caregivers spend double the time on their activity as opposed to traditional employment. Data from the United Nations during the COVID pandemic shows the immense economic value of care work provided by women. 4 hours a day, $11 trillion per year. Women comprise 70% of health workers globally, and even higher shares of care-related occupations such as nursing, midwifery, and community health work. On top of that, they work under bad conditions for low pay, even if it's there, and of course with no power and no voice in making decisions. The ratios between paid and unpaid care work vary widely around the world. Everywhere women are at a disadvantage compared to men. It's not just Africa, where Edna lives, it's also in high-income countries where women are thought to be more emancipated and where gender gaps have almost closed, allegedly. Around the world, 42% of women cannot secure jobs because they are responsible for caregiving. In 89% of households, women and girls perform the majority of household chores. Why do we have the separation between work and care? Where does it come from? What is all this caregiving activity good for? In order for a civilization to exist, humans have to do work. Some of that work is done for what is called social reproduction, which feminist economists define as the daily sustenance of workers, the intergenerational reproduction of the labor force, including biological reproduction and the care of dependents, and the work involved in transmitting the norms, culture, skills required to reproduce workers as a class. In other words, social reproduction creates the generations of workers who take jobs to keep the economy running. Feminist economists add nuance, thoughtfulness, empathy, relationships to understanding work. They ask questions such as, who is supposed to pay for work, regardless of how it is defined? Who has the willingness to pay? Are we supposed to have a market for all kinds of work? Is doing work for somebody else a voluntary transaction with equal power? Who decides the price of work? Who has the power to terminate the transaction? We are now at the core of the problem, which is the conflict between the rhythms of life and the philosophy of capitalism. The existence of life, human and non-human, requires care to maintain its well-being. The logic of capitalism is focused on making so-called rational decisions to produce stuff for the needs of humans. But capitalism doesn't stop to ask women and men what are their actual needs, or how they wish to satisfy their needs, or what is the value of their work, what is the psychological burden of work, and so on. Life and social reproduction are for capitalism a distraction, a nuisance, a costly inconvenience that capitalism does not wish to deal with, unless forced by competition, by the state, or by heavy social pressure. Why does capitalism not recognize and pay the value of care work? Because it can still get away with it. The system evolved with men having virtually all the political and economic power. Men created the rules that only work done by men deserves to be paid. Work done by women in the household and elsewhere belonged to a different realm, as if it were a parallel universe whose purpose was to maintain the universe of men. This is what it means to have a genderized economic system. Men still have, to a very large extent, virtually all the power. We call this a heteropatriarchal system. Ask the internet how many women have positions of power. Amaia Pérez Orozco writes that the inherent tension between capital and life is absorbed in households. Households allow for maintaining the semblance of social peace and allowing for the reproduction not only of the workforce, but of capitalist relations themselves. There is no thank you from Wall Street for what we do at home to be ready for work the next day. In the view of feminist economists, the production that is carried out under capitalism is akin to a fantasy, a delusion, because it ignores and denies the physical limits of the planet. The logic behind this production is in opposition from the logic of life itself. We as a society got carried away with believing that an economic system largely designed by men can take human civilization far into the future, increase the well-being for everyone, and not mess up the planet all at the same time. One way to see this conflict between capitalism that wants to accumulate wealth and the rhythms of life is in the work-life balance conversations. You may convince your employer to allow you to work from home so you can save time on your commute, which will make you happier and therefore more productive for your employer. But when a family member gets sick and you have to stay at home to take care of them, then the conflict becomes clear. You have to come to the office. Your employer always wins. And that's not enough. The control of workers is done using feminist methods. It's ironic. We are told to identify with the company's objectives as if they were our own personal objectives, just like we care for others' well-being as if it were our own. When we are laid off, without being consulted in advance, we are told that it is a divorce, as if the company was somehow our family. But wait, which families look like corporations? Those that look like patriarchal pyramids, with men at the top. At the same time, we are also told to work in teams, but we are given individual incentives in a divide and control scheme that is supposed to extract maximum value from employees and discard individuals that do not comply. Jane Humphries and Carmen Sarasua have written about the feminization of the labor force and 5 associated myths. Myth number 1 is that high women's labor force participation rates are a new phenomenon. The number of women engaging in paid work is highest in some of the poorest and richest countries in the world, and it is lowest in countries with national incomes in the middle range. In other words, the relationship between female participation rates and gross domestic product per capita follows a U-shape. The problem was not that women decided to stay at home, but there were few job opportunities and gender stereotypes that trapped them at home. Myth number 2 is that feminization has involved steady progress. 2 examples to bust this myth, but there are others as well. In the US, after 1945, the return of veterans from war and cutbacks to war industries displaced many women workers from these industries, even though women wanted to remain employed. The same happened also throughout Europe. Second example, in Italy, while the economy grew faster after World War II, the participation of women in paid work actually decreased because women who used to work in agriculture failed to find alternative employment. Myth Myth number 3 is that men's participation rates have always been extremely high in contrast with women's labor force participation rate. Traditionally, women were thought to do irregular, seasonal, or part-time work, but in reality, men were engaged in similar work as well, which actually affected how participation rates were reported in statistics. Myth number 4 is that labor force participation will automatically lead to women's empowerment and independence. Even if women get a job alongside men, the pattern remains that they tend to be paid less than men. Working for money does not exempt women from the burden of unpaid work. They continue to perform domestic and caring work, often doing multiple shifts with adverse effects on their well-being. Men have increased their contribution to unpaid work, but not enough to compensate women for their increased participation in the paid labor force. Myth number 5 is that gender pay gap is determined by women's own choices. It appears that the difference between the earnings of men and the earnings of women is going down, meaning that the pay gap between men and women is closing. Traditional economists say that the gap exists because women are less productive. Women tend to interrupt work to provide care. Women tend to work part-time, all of which is their choice, allegedly. But this pay gap does not account for discrimination. Women provide care outside paid employment and then are expected to be productive in the traditional economy by the same standards as men. And if they are not as productive, then it is used against them. They are paid less, then they qualify for smaller future pensions. Moreover, the pay gaps can bounce back and become higher again, so progress is not guaranteed, as you can see in these examples and more. And sometimes the pay gap may close not because women are paid more, but because men are paid less. So it only appears that the gap is closing. It's important to put data into context. Imagine we all had the universal basic income where all adult citizens, women and men, received an unconditional monthly amount in cash that is enough to live on, regardless whether they work or not. This UBI would still not differentiate genderized work. It would help a lot with recognizing the value of unpaid work, but it would still not be enough. Capitalists pay work because it serves their incentives to make profit out of production. The social reproduction of life does not operate on the same profit incentive. Social reproduction obviously has different incentives, like the well-being of people and the continuation of life. Who should pay the work done for social reproduction? How much should it be? Should payment for parental leave be linked to previous salary? What if women had a low salary before they became mothers? Should mothers receive different payments for parental leave? Should all newborn in the world be treated the same? How about caring for seniors or doing household work like Edna in Zimbabwe? Capitalism does not want to pay Edna $15 per hour for her household work, or for any work for that matter. Why? Because there would be little profit left for the owners of capital. Even if Edna's children went to dig up cobalt with their hands for the benefit of capitalists and consumers in rich countries, Edna herself would still not be paid. All those hours raising children that become workers do not matter for capitalists. Maybe her children will be paid once they become workers, but they will not be paid $100 an hour for the high-risk work they do. This must also be said. Child work is an abomination. No children should ever have to work, for pay or not, regardless if it's in a mine, at the grocery store, at the fast food chain, delivering flyers, or any work for that matter. My goal for this video was to raise awareness about feminist economics. That is a vast domain of study and activism, deeply rooted in real life and strongly linked with the human condition, in stark contrast with the cold rationalist philosophy of capitalism. There are many subfields in feminist economics, some focus on ecology, some on gender identities and emancipations, some on degrowth, some on Marxism. Your takeaway from this video could be to free your mind from the chains that were dropped on you by capitalism. We now understand and feel better the fundamental role of women in maintaining our species on this planet. Women's contribution to society and economy overwhelms any industry, any technology by orders of magnitude. If the work of women and everyone working in feminized activities was properly recognized, dignified, and paid, we would no longer live in capitalism. When we go about our lives, now we know how capitalism is organized. We recognize injustice. We see the women of the world keeping civilization alive. We know what needs to be done. If you can, please support me through the links below to cover the costs of these videos. Future videos will likely not be possible without your support. I will never collect money from advertising because I strongly believe that education should not be tainted by consumerism. Until next time, be well and increase the peace.
Catch it, put it in a jar to have and to hold, to save for later. You cannot trust it to come again, to wait for you to find a pen and fill the paper with the message that it wants to send. Grab it, hold it by its tail before it escapes. You know its ways and you cannot lose it, that's what you fear. So hold it up against your ear and very carefully listen to what it wants you to hear. Whoa, 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 whoa. Sleeping in its nest before it wakes up. Touch it gently, you want it feeling completely calm, so you can hold it in your palm and help it grow just like it was born to be. Come, come, come.